Thank you.
Hello again. So it's great to be back. And yes, I love talking about the SR&ED program, and it's been a particularly exciting year for anyone who's been following along, either with a frontline seat or to the side. So last year when I came and spoke with you, I talked about the consultations that happened late in the year. So a lot has happened since then. Today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is the big program updates, as well as some interesting access to information requests that we've had. So the fall economic statement, the federal budget, the launch of the new review guide, and a little bit about tax earned by audit and gross negligence penalties. So last time we spoke, I talked about the consultation and some of the positions that were put forward by a number of the larger groups and associations, and that culminated in the fall economic statement, which came out December 16th and proposed significant and exciting changes for the SR&ED program. But the initial optimism surrounding that announcement was really short-lived, since the Minister of Finance resigned and an election was called. And at that time, it was unclear whether or not we would see this come to fruition. So we went through the election, and here we are almost a year later, and we now have the announcements that were made in the federal budget, which was passed just recently, but we're still waiting for the exact details. But the high levels were in the budget document. So the big ones that people were lobbying for and were pleasantly surprised by was the enhanced expenditure limit, raised to $6 million. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The expanded phase-out range being increased when you have taxable capital. We now have eligibility for certain public corporations, capital expenditures being reinstated, and then there are proposed administrative modernizations that they're working on as well, because this is one of the largest programs in all of Canada, and there's always room for improvement. So the most significant one that will impact likely most of the individuals in this room in some capacity, either as advisors, consultants, accountants, is the enhanced expenditure limit, which has been raised to $6 million. Originally, it was announced that it was going to be 4.5, and they decided to make it even bigger, so they've doubled it. What this means is CCPC spending $6 million on R&D can now receive up to $2.1 million in refundable credits versus the 1.05 mentioned previously. Now, one thing to keep in mind with regards to this announcement, because I know I was quite excited and I sat down and I modeled it in a spreadsheet, but these are just the federal values that have been impacted. The provinces haven't really indicated whether or not they'll follow suit. So, for example, the limit on the eligible expenditures at the Ontario level remain the same for the refundable tax credits. So you won't see the entirety of the refund doubling, just the federal portion if you are in this range. The next big one is the change to the phase-out range. So if you had clients that had significant taxable capital, it began to grind the tax credit and it would decrease the refundable rate. That's been bumped up 15 to 75 million. So that is a change from the 10 to 50 million, which is quite nice. So again, if you have larger groups that were applying for the SR&ED program, they now have a little bit more incentive, because historically it was more the smaller firms that tended to get more of a benefit. And at least I noticed in my practice is that the larger firms tended to lose a little bit of interest because it wasn't the same sort of return that they were seeing. It tended to stagnate even if their R&D expenditures went up. The really exciting news was the eligibility being extended to some public corporations. So certain Canadian public corporations can now access that 35% refundable tax credit rate, which was previously reserved for Canadian-controlled private corporations. They were very vague about it in the budget, but in the fall economic statement, they gave more details in terms of what that would mean. So in terms of it, it is the requirements. They call it a eligible corporation. So an eligible Canadian public corporation would be a corporation that throughout the tax year is resident in Canada, has its class of shares listed on a designated stock exchange, and apparently this will be on the Department of Finance website, and is not controlled directly or indirectly in any manner whatsoever by one or more non-resident persons. So there are going to be some restrictions on it. I know it was the Toronto Stock Exchange that was really hoping to see this happen, because you'd have companies that on paper were very, very similar in terms of their R&D expenditures, except one was public and one was private, and the private company got to benefit from the refundable federal tax credits, whereas the public company didn't. So that's quite exciting. And also capital expenditures. Yeah, I really wanted to be excited about capital expenditures being reinstated because they disappeared back in 2014. But again, it's on the federal amount. Don't know what will happen on the provincial levels yet. I know a number, it tends to follow what the federal group does. Then we see the provinces mirror it, but many provinces had phased this out as well. We think in our office that it will follow the prior capital expenditures policy in terms of the restrictions. For those who had put in claims under this previously, one of the challenges was that it had to really strictly be used for R&D. And sometimes it's just not worth the hassle of putting it onto your SR&ED claim and then seeing if it ends up moving into production at a later date, then clawing back some of the costs. So this has mixed feelings for me. I think it'll be helpful for some groups. I know that they're looking more at their capital expenditures, but what wasn't explicit is lease expenditures, which is also a significant expense. And for the topic of the day, which is AI and machine learning, a lot of the costs that we're seeing are around, cloud compute and provisioning of data in the cloud, and that means that those expenses won't be covered under this. I don't know if that will change, but I know a number of groups would be very happy if they could get some of those costs recovered. The other big one that they announced, and we'll see how it progresses, is the administrative modernization. So we've seen a few variations of things over the years. We had the pre-claim consultation, which would tell you if there was scientific research and experimental development work. They also had the SALT tool that's still in existence. But as some people unfortunately found out, a pre-claim consultation was not a pre-claim approval. So they would go through this process and then they'd still get audited. They are now introducing a pre-claim approval. But the caveat on the language they put out was before businesses undertake any work or incur costs. So you'd actually have to be quite organized to go and take advantage of a pre-claim approval in this context, if we're reading it exactly as written. The other one was AI-assisted triage to fast-track low-risk claims. This was hinted at last year in the interview with CPA Canada, but one thing to note is that there's not saying low-value claims, because sometimes the impression is if I'm putting in a smaller claim, then it's less likely they're going to be reviewed, but they stated low-risk claims, and then there are no details as to what they consider low risk in this setting. I think it has potential to be really good, but we'll have to see how it's ultimately rolled out. And then a 90-day processing target for those pre-approved claims. So in theory, it will go through more quickly. So this is the exact text from the budget. It'll be in the download available after this meeting, but this is what it looked like in the budget itself. So they outlined the current process and then the optimized process. And for those of us, again, who've been doing it for a number of years, it can actually be quite quick from day zero to when you get your refund. The 60 days, if you're going to be approved and it's a refundable claim, it tends to go quite quickly. But they're adding in this additional pre-claim approval step, and in theory it means that you'll be processed more quickly. Again, the caveat in here is the CRA stops the clock when they're asking you for information. Sorry, they start the clock when they ask you for information, but they tend to stop it once they're working on it. So the numbers can be adjusted, if you will. And if you have a non-refundable claim, then you tend to get put at the bottom of the pile anyhow. So I don't know if this will actually make much, if any, difference, aside from the pre-claim approval being really helpful for any companies that choose to factor their tax credits and get an advance on what they have spent with a financing company. Really, again, everyone's excited about AI. I am as well. But there are risks that come with AI processing the SR&ED claims as well, because people will start writing it for AI to read. And I've had some groups come to me with their pre-written SR&ED technical narratives, and it's very clear that it's written with AI. And AI is a tool. You still need a human in the loop. So that's the big update on the budget. I'll pause at the end for any questions, but I really want to talk about the SR&ED review guide as well, because this was a big update, and I think a much needed update to the actual administration of the program. For those who aren't aware, there's a whole guide that explains what the reviewer is supposed to be doing when they come out and speak with you. I'm not entirely sure how many of the reviewers actually know about the guide or that it's been updated. I would like to think that it's been clearly communicated internally, but my experiences recently is that there's still some people following kind of the older approach, and they have definitely changed some things in this review guide. So the review guide consolidates. There was a technical review, and then there was also a separate document that talked more about the finances, and this is now a more integrated version. What is really important to note is the messaging that's coming from the CRA right now. They want more supporting documentation. We talked about that earlier in the call when it was discussed in the Tax Court of Canada rulings. The ones that were more likely to succeed had better documentation. They really do want you to have good supporting documentation that is dated and specific to the work performed. Again, so many people are relying on AI to write things right now, including their SR&ED documentation. And the CRA can see that as well as anyone else. When you've seen a lot of AI written text, it's an issue. So be aware that that fifth criteria, the documentation was generated as a result of the work performed, is being reinforced in the SR&ED review guide, both for the SR&ED work and the SR&ED expenditures. The salary and wages policy has not changed, but I've seen significant pushback against any allocation methods. So keep that in mind. But one of the key clarifications as well, historically, they'd ranked the types of evidence that was being provided, and they really drive home now that oral statements are not a substitute for keeping adequate documentation or other evidence. So for that one client that likes to say, it's fine if they come out, I'll just explain it to them, that is not the ideal approach, and it's a very high-risk approach with some of the reviewers right now. Other things is the wording and the organization of the review guide. So the original review steps, when we were talking only about technical reviews, it was more geared towards the RTA. This one is even more geared towards the taxpayer. So the new review steps include the start of the review meeting and request for additional information, and the end of the review. I really like that there's a repeated emphasis on clarity and transparency in these documents. The actual implementation, I think, has room for improvement, but ideally the reviewer is now explaining to you why the information is needed. Not just, I need this, but why it's needed. So in theory, at the start of the review, you'll be contacted by phone, and the issues identified in your claims should be discussed. So they're supposed to be as specific as possible when identifying the issues. The get out of jail clause that they have in here is, however, the ability to do so can depend on the content of the information submitted in the claim. but really it's there asking for them to be as specific as possible aligns with this guide. They are supposed to send you an initial letter in advance that will outline what was discussed in the call, as well as a list of any information being requested to address the issue. So we've all seen the shopping list letters from the CRA. In theory, they're supposed to be more targeted at this time. Again, a meeting agenda identifying the issues and related projects as well. So the word issue, you can see it's starting to come out more in this document, that they're looking to have this area communicate with you more effectively. You may need to remind the CRA of this and ask for more details. We've seen cases where the CRA has a last-minute cancellation. They try and put someone into that slot and kind of skip over some of these steps. So just be aware of pausing and asking for this information, because it is aligned with the review guide as it's now written. I thought this was really interesting as well in terms of the review meeting itself. They talked more about what to expect in it, the usual things of you should come prepared, have the documentation, and so on. However, they now outline what you should expect at the end of the meeting. So we usually get the agenda, it'll talk about the beginning parts and do the training, and then go through the various issues on the technical and financial side. But here is your checklist for the end of the meeting, as it should be in an ideal situation. So the reviewers should be verbally providing you a summary of their understanding of the work so that you can correct any misunderstandings, any clarification they obtained regarding the issues. They should be explicit about the areas where they still have concerns and require further clarification, if applicable. The information that is still missing and needs to be obtained, again, if applicable, along with the deadline. The preliminary review findings, of course, there's an asterisk in case they don't have them yet, recommendations for future claims, and the next steps. So I know, at least in my experience, sitting down with the CRA, we got to the end of one meeting and they tried to cut the meeting short because we had started late due to technical issues. And it was a case of pausing and being like, no, let's take this next few moments to go through this list and make sure that we've addressed everything that's on it. And as part of that, when they talked about, well, I have a concern with X, they were able to correct it in that misunderstanding in real time. So really handy list to have on hand when you're going through the review. So it's a great update here. And then the last step covers the usual things of what happens after a review meeting, and consolidates what you should be doing. So that's the other big update, is the SR&ED review guide. So we have an increase in what you can expect in terms of refunds. If you have larger claims, I would expect that there will likely be more claims. You have clarification about the reviews and some of the documentation expectations. But here's where it gets a little bit colorful, is someone reached out to me and they said, I had an unfortunate experience and I filed a number of ATIPs to confirm something, and they forwarded the ATIPs to me and we analyzed them in-house as well. And the rumors that we've been hearing for years about tax earned by audit, there is some validity to it. So in one of the ATIPs, what we saw is that it is being counted in tax earned by audit calculations, and it's increased over the years. So from 155 million up to 241 million in terms of how they calculate the tax earned by audit. So that's anything that is denied effectively. And the other big thing that's happening is gross negligence penalties are starting to be applied. And you may have heard of it in a few different places, but this is confirmation that it's occurring significantly more than it did before, and that it's being applied within more SR&ED audits. So under subsection 163, the CRA can apply a gross negligence penalty when, in their view, the taxpayer knowingly or under circumstances amounting to gross negligence makes a false statement or omission. It's a huge financial penalty. It's huge, typically 50% of the understated tax. And it's gone up dramatically in the SR&ED program. So if we look all the way back to 2018, there were only 3 cases of it being applied in SR&ED. It dropped. I mean, we can assume some of that is due to the pandemic, but coming out of that, we've seen it dramatically increasing for the last few years. And the total value that's come out of it is significant as well. So $2 million to $4 million to over $5 million. The number of fully denied claims from the SR&ED program, I mean, it's varied, and the amounts have unfortunately gone up. So 2020, when it seemed like everything was being approved, effectively it was. 2021, 22, there was more scrutiny. But if you're feeling that there is more pressure in 2023 and 2024, it's correct, that impression. It's definitely increasing over the last few years. So that's something to be very cognizant of. Again, if you have a client who maybe has skated a little close to the edge, it's time to firm up those practices, because this can directly impact them in a way that can be devastating for their business. And it's very difficult to fight these. So it's an unfortunate situation, because the SR&ED program is ideally intended to encourage businesses to apply. But if auditors or directors are being assessed based on TIBA, which is the rumor, and it's being counted, that contradicts an incentive program. And applying gross negligence penalties more aggressively also acts as a deterrent. I know that some of the loveliest groups that I work with who are 100% on board, even they're concerned. They're like, well, what if they misinterpret what I said? So it's had a chilling effect. But it has its place, because there are some questionable claims that are being submitted to the CRA. But this is quite substantial. They didn't formally link TIBA to compensation or performance pay in the ATIPs, but the Ontario Auditor General did identify it as one of the main internal performance indicators. It might not apply to SR&ED. It wasn't clear in the ATIPs we saw and we reviewed. But without greater clarification, especially in relation to this program, it's likely going to cause some challenges, because I don't see these numbers going down in 2025. I would expect that in 2025, these numbers will continue to increase. So for further reading, there are a number of articles that we've written on the topic, and we'll be writing more about it, about the budget, about the changes to the review manual, about TIBA and gross negligence penalties. But I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions about the program changes and give everyone the opportunity to ask questions.
I think one of the things that to mention is Manitoba never phased out capital, so they're fully in line with capital, just for the
That's great. Yeah,
viewing pleasures. The other thing that would be interesting, and I assume, but you know what happens when someone assumes something, what that stands for. If CRA is using AI, I assume they have their own internal database, like some big corporations do, such that it does not become the public knowledge. And I don't know if there's anything specifically on that topic. I mean, it should be because that, but I don't know if you've seen anything specifically related to that.
They alluded to that in, there was a director who did an interview with CPA Canada last year, and she alluded to using AI to process claims, and the budget does seem to suggest they're going to start using AI to process claims more quickly. It would be an in-house tool, but there's very little that's publicly available beyond that.
And I think your point about the whole gross negligence penalties, what I found interesting was there's only 3 applied in 18. It's almost the same amount as was applied for 80. 68 million versus 76 million
Mm-hmm.
of denied expenditures. So I guess there's a lot more people doing smaller gross negligence. But yes, I think it can be a deterrent, but my humble opinion is it's good for our industry to get some of the less scrupulous people out in the companies. I mean, I think everybody's heard about the one many years ago where they did a city block and every single person,
Yeah.
including this corner store, was put in for a claim, and if CRA came to audit them, they withdraw them. And of course, you can't do that anymore because CRA will
Yeah.
not allow you to withdraw them. That's how they stopped that. But so it's not entirely bad in my humble opinion. We do.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's a place for it because there's no barrier, as most people on the call will know, but for those who don't, there's no barrier to entry to becoming an SR&ED consultant. There's no degree in SR&ED consulting. There's no professional exams. So someone who's left their job or been terminated from their job can wake up the next day and claim to be a SR&ED consultant because they may have written one back in 2015. So there are some questionable characters. There are some individuals who don't have as much experience. The challenge is that, and this is a rumor that has not been confirmed, but that the gross negligence penalties are not just being applied in obvious cases, but also borderline cases. And that can be a little bit challenging from what I've heard. Now, I see Justin has his hand up.
Just before we get to that, there's a couple of questions. There's one in particular that relates to this discussion we're on, and it's, are there any examples of what negligence actually means? Is it about making false claims or exaggerated claims?
Yeah, so that's effectively what it means is by deliberately misstating or omission. I didn't prepare the claim, but I have seen one where they copied and pasted the exact same technical narrative over multiple years. And they had no supporting documentation for what they were doing, and they wrote all of their supporting documentations the day it was requested using AI. And that, I mean, anything that you would consider, I think, borderline fraud and knowingly misrepresenting your work is like that would be for me the boundaries of it. But if it's a routine disagreement between what is and isn't eligible, I mean, we have these disagreements all the time with the CRA, right? We're always saying, well, you know what, we put it in because we sincerely believe this to fall within the boundaries of the program, which is different from, you know, I claimed my dog on the tax schedule as a specified employee and paid him $100,000. Like fraud is really the boundary here.
Absolutely.
Well, I've actually I inherited a client from another preparer who they had been claiming successfully for about 6 or 7 years. Mind you, I don't believe they had been previously reviewed. And when they went to review, they were found to be substanceless, and the prior preparer did not attend the meeting. And that was enough for them to apply a $75,000 gross negligence penalty.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Before we get, there's one other question, but people can feel free to submit questions before or after. One of the things that we wanted to talk about and hoping to get some feedback before I get to the last question, but again, there's time for more questions. We're looking at potential topics for future events. One of the things that has been brought up and I think might interest a lot of people is you may be aware that Quebec has significantly revamped their system, and therefore it may be interesting for a session to be done on what the new system is like and highlighting the differences between federal and Quebec, because they are fairly significant now. Another item that people have mentioned that might be of interest is detailed artificial intelligence patent examples. Then another third one is SR&ED tax planning issues similar to wages. So that's another one. If people have any other ideas, we would love you to submit them to us. So you can either send them to myself, Earl at VinerR&D.com, or to David at dsabina@muke.net.